Hello, this is my second video as a rational ethicist. Today I will be talking about the maximum relative preferences principle. So as we saw in the previous video, I talked about consistent ethical systems. Ethical systems that contain moral principles that avoid unwanted arbitrariness. So one of those ethical systems is a kind of utilitarian or consequentialist system. And I will call it the maximum relative preferences principle. And it goes as follows. We have to choose a situation that maximizes the sum of everyone's self-determined relative preferences. So what does this mean? Well, first we have to look at the personal preferences. So we have to distinguish those preferences from, for example, unconscious interests. There are objects in the world, plants, computers, for example, and they seem to have interests. For example, this computer has an interest not to be infected by a virus, a computer virus, but these are unconscious interests. On the other hand, there are sentient beings, and those beings, they experience a personal preference for certain situations. When they have pain, they prefer a situation when they are not in pain. So these are the personal preferences of conscious, subjective, sentient beings. So that's the starting point, the preferences. Now, a difference with a simple utilitarian, a preference utilitarian principle is that a total preference, utilitarianism, maximizes the preferences of everyone. Whereas my principle, the maximum relative preference principle, maximizes relative preferences. So what are these relative preferences? Well, suppose you're in a situation, and in that situation you have a certain preference for that situation. That measures how strongly you like or prefer that situation. Now, we can also compare this preference with, for example, if you're in that situation, you might prefer another situation. You might have a stronger preference for another situation where you feel more happy or so. And so you can take the difference between the preference for your current situation and the preference that you have in your current situation for the other situation where you would be more happy. So this is a relative preference. It depends on what these references mean. Someone can decide that the reference means a situation where you have zero preference. For example, a situation where you do not exist. So I do exist in this current situation, I have a preference for my situation, but I can imagine a situation where I do not exist and where I do not have any preferences. My preference would be zero. Yeah. So I can take the difference between the preference in my current situation and a zero preference, a reference state where I have a zero preference. I will come back later to what is why this is important, these relative preferences. So the relative preferences are the differences between the preference of your current situation for your current situation and preference for a reference situation, a reference preference. That makes this theory a bit different from a simple utilitarian theory, because a simple preference utilitarian theory only looks at the preferences for your current situation. It does not include this reference preferences. So these relative preferences, they have to be distinguished from projected preferences. In this maximum relative preferences theory, the preferences are self-determined. That means that you have preferences and you can determine for yourself what your preferences are. You can determine your reference situation, your preference for your current situation, that's all up to you. It's self-determined, it's up to you. So these are your personal preferences, and they have to be distinguished from projected preferences. So I can project my preferences on you. For example, when I like chocolate, I can say that you like chocolate as well, but perhaps you don't like chocolate. If I believe that you like chocolate, I project my preference for chocolate on you. And in that sense, I violate your autonomy. You can determine for yourself your preference for chocolate. So that's a basic distinction between personal preferences and projected preferences. When we maximize relative preferences, it means we maximize the self-determined or autonomous relative preferences, and not the preferences that we project on others. And that makes this theory gives it a very strong justification. So we maximize everyone's preferences, and we take into account what everyone determines as their own preferences. So everyone can decide for themselves what they prefer in which situations, and we take everyone's preference into account and we maximize those preferences. That means there are no external imposed restrictions on those preferences. No one else can determine the preferences of an individual or project their own preferences on that individual. So, to avoid arbitrary exclusion, this principle applies to everyone and everything. The relative preferences of objects or non-existing persons, they can be neglected. Objects, they do not have a consciousness, they are not aware of anything, so they do not have these subjective personal preferences. So we can say that for objects, the personal preferences are zero. And the same goes for people who do not exist. If you do not exist, your preferences are zero. And that means that we have to take the preferences of all sentient beings into account, because they have personal preferences. However, it becomes a bit complicated. Some sentient beings are not aware of their reference preferences. And in that case, basically we are allowed to determine what counts as their reference preference. But that's an issue I will not go into now. So I explained why this theory is different from utilitarian theory, a simple preference utilitarian theory, because we look at these reference states. And that is important because we face some problems in population ethics. So in population ethics, we have choices that determine who will exist and how many sentient beings will exist in the future. So if you want to maximize the total preferences of all sentient beings, we can do a thought experiment. Suppose we start with a situation where everyone is maximally happy. We have a population of 1 billion people and all those people are maximally happy. But suppose we can choose a second situation where those same people, the billion individuals, are maximally unhappy. They are miserable. But their misery is compensated by introducing trillions of other sentient beings who have a slightly positive well-being, so lives barely worth living. So we have trillions of people who have a very small positive well-being. If we add all those, they have a very small positive preference for being alive and being in that second situation. If we add up all those preferences of all those trillions of new coming beings, the total preference of the second situation can be bigger than the preference of the first situation. So in the first situation, we have a small group of maximally happy people. In the second situation, we have the small group of maximally unhappy people and a very, very big extra group of people who are slightly happy. So that's a very counterintuitive conclusion of total preference utilitarianism, the conclusion that we have to choose a second situation where everyone of the first population is miserable and where there are trillions of extra lives who have lives barely worth living. That's called a repugnant or sadistic conclusion in population ethics. And there are ways to avoid this repugnant conclusion, to say that the first situation is basically the best situation. And how do we do this? This is where those reference preferences become important. So if you take as a reference preference the preference for a situation where you have zero preference, then we have this problem of total utilitarianism, where we simply maximize everyone's preferences. But we can do something different. We can take as the reference situation the situation that is most wanted by an individual. So again, you are in a current situation. In this situation, you have a preference for this current situation. But you also have a stronger preference for your most preferred situation. So in this situation where you are now, you have a preference for another situation that you consider as the best situation. Okay, this other situation can be considered as a reference, and this most wanted, this preferred state is your reference preference. That means that in your current state you can basically complain that you are not in your most preferred state. So suppose I choose a situation, and that's your current situation, and I didn't choose a situation where you have a highest preference. So in this current situation you can complain to me. You can say I should have chosen the other situation that is most wanted by you, that you have the strongest preference. And this complaint, what we can do is basically minimize those complaints of everyone. So if we take as a reference situation the situation that is most preferred by an individual, this maximum relative preference theory becomes a minimize complaint theory, where we minimize everyone's complaints. Okay. So if you look again at our dilemma, we have two situations. The first situation, everyone who exists, the existing population, they are maximally happy, so they cannot complain. And there are trillions of non-existing individuals. If they don't exist, they don't have preferences, they don't have complaints, so no complaints there. And in the second situation, this first group of individuals, they are maximally unhappy and they have very strong complaints. They strongly prefer the first situation. So if you choose the second situation, they can very strongly complain to you, say that you should have chosen the first situation. And then there is the extra group of trillions, slightly happy people. In the second situation, they cannot complain, because they have a maximum preference there. So we see that in the second situation, the first group have very strong complaints, whereas in the first situation, there was no complaint. So if we minimize complaints, that means the first situation is the best. Okay. So now we avoid this repugnant or sadistic conclusion. We can say that a situation where a small group of very happy people is better than the second situation, where this group is maximally unhappy and where there are other people who are trivially happy. Now, this minimize complaint theory also has some problems. If we simply want to minimize complaints, it results to the conclusion that it's better that no one exists, because if no one exists, there will be no complaints. So we should stop procreating. So now we can adapt the situation a little bit. Suppose our choices have a causal influence on who will exist in the future. And suppose we choose a situation where people in the future exist. So those future generations, they might have complaints. Suppose first of all that they have a positive preference. They prefer being alive than not being born. Okay, they have a positive preference, but still every one of them can complain because there is always another situation where, for example, a person has all the resources. Yeah. If there are several people in the future, they have to divide resources, and one individual can complain and say, I should have all the resources. So everyone can complain, basically. Now, if they complain against us, we decide their existence. If they complain against us, and if we say, okay, if we take your complaint into account and we minimize complaints, that means you would not exist. And that's something not preferred by those future generations. So that basically means that it's not good for those future generations to complain against our choice, to let them be born. And here again, that means that those future generations, they can decide whether their complaint is valid. Or in other words, their complaint, it depends on this reference preference. And so they can choose a reference preference such that their complaint is not valid, is 0. Okay, so they will not complain against us, and that means they can exist, they are allowed to exist in the future. They cannot complain because if they would complain, they would not exist. So in this sense, we have to leave it up to them to decide whether or not they complain. It's up to them to choose their reference preference. Yeah. They can choose reference preference 0 or their most preferred state, or something else in such a way that in some cases they cannot complain. And in this way we avoid this repugnant conclusion. So this maximum relative preference theory, it actually maximally respects autonomy. Everyone can determine for themselves their relative preferences. So those preferences, for example, they can be a function of well-being, of happiness. If everyone would choose for their preference function that only depends on happiness, we arrive at a hedonistic utilitarianism, maximize total happiness. But of course, it's up to an individual to decide what they prefer, and if they prefer other things than happiness, fine, then we have to take that preference into account. It can also be, it's also possible that this preference or utility function, as they call it, that's why it's called utilitarianism. It's also possible that this preference is a concave function of well-being. So a concave function, it's like a logarithm or a square root function. It has a curvature. And this means that well-being has a decreasing marginal utility. So if you add 1 unit of well-being, it's not simply adding 1 unit of preference or utility. Yeah, the utility decreases. Or in other words, the difference in preference between well-being 1 and well-being 0 is bigger than the difference in preference between well-being 2 and well-being 1. Yeah, the more well-being you already have, the less important extra units of well-being become. If everyone would choose this concave function as a preference function, a concave function of well-being, then we arrive at a theory with what is called prioritarianism. That says that we have to increase everyone's well-being, but we have to give a higher priority to increasing the well-being of the worst of people, the people who have the lowest levels of well-being. So that's prioritarianism. Give priority for the lowest levels of well-being, increase their well-being. But again, we leave it up to the individual to decide for themselves how their preference function looks like. Yeah? It does not have to be prioritarianism. It does not have to be hedonistic utilitarianism. It does not have to be total preference utilitarianism. Another thing that we face is what about inconsistencies in preferences? Suppose, well, there are two kinds of inconsistencies called synchronous and intertemporal. The intertemporal inconsistencies are easy to deal with. So suppose I strongly prefer something at this moment, time t, this moment I prefer something, and at a later moment, time t plus 1, later in my life, I no longer prefer that thing. Yeah? So I change my mind, my preferences change over time. Now, an individual, a person like me, can be fully described or defined as the set of all my preferences. Yeah? Which means that if I have changing preferences, if later in my life I have different preferences, actually that means that in the future I am a different person. So my future alter ego, my future self, is no longer the same person as my current self at this moment in time. Yeah. So that's possible that over your course of your life you are different persons. And again, the theory says that we have to take everyone's preference into account, not only the preferences of your current self, but also the preferences of the future alter egos of your self, your future states. Another problem is the problem of synchronous inconsistency. That means that at this moment in time you can have different contradicting preferences. It's possible that at the same time you want something and you don't want something. So suppose that a friend lies to you, and you will never be able to know that it was a lie. Now, and if you know the truth, then you would be very unhappy. Yeah. So that's why your friend lied, because if you told the truth, you would be unhappy. Now, you have a preference for happiness, so that's one thing. But the question is, does this make this lie permissible? Not necessarily, because you might also have a preference to know the truth. And these are two contradicting preferences. If you have this preference to know the truth and you would know the truth, you would be unhappy and your preference for happiness would not be satisfied. Okay, so we have conflicting preferences. Now, this theory says that you can determine for yourself what you prefer, and in this case you have to determine your strongest preferences, what you prefer the most. If you have a stronger preference to know the truth, then we have to respect this preference to tell the truth. And so that means that lying is not permissible. But again, it's up to you. You can decide what preference you would like. So another situation is I'm in this state, I exist, but I can prefer a situation where I do not exist. For example, suppose I had to choose between this situation where I exist or another situation where I will not be born, but where everyone else is maximally happy. In that case, I would have liked the second situation, even if in that situation I do not exist. Yeah? So there's no one I can identify myself with in this other situation. Or it might be possible also that I can choose another situation where I'll become a completely different person, where I'll be brainwashed. Suppose in this other situation everyone is maximally happy and I will be brainwashed and become a completely different person. then I can still prefer this other situation, the situation where I'll be different. So here it comes down to with who I can identify myself with. I can identify myself with a future state of mind, yeah, a future person, the person tomorrow that I think is me. But yeah, actually this theory to respect autonomy, the preferences depend on with whom a person can identify himself with. And we really fit up to the person themselves with whom they can identify themselves with. So again, this theory maximally respects autonomy. And with this theory, we can avoid all kinds of discussions, problems in moral philosophy. So the problem whether to maximize happiness or some other kind of measure of well-being, the problem of personal identity over time, what to do with changing minds, with people changing minds, with situations of brainwashing, what to do with conflicting preferences and situations of lying and keeping promises, what to do with population ethics situations where our choices have an influence on who will exist in the future. These are all things, all kind of problems, and actually with this theory we avoid these problems. This theory to maximize the self-determined relative preferences of everyone. So the self-determined means that we can avoid all these tricky problems in ethics. And as a result, we might end up with a kind of a mixture of different utilitarian theories. Yeah? Total preference utilitarianism, hedonistic utilitarianism, the minimum complaint utilitarianism, or a critical level utilitarianism. That's also a utilitarian theory that takes as its reference situation, a situation where you have a positive non-zero preference. So that's a critical level, and you prefer situations where you have a higher preference than this critical level preference. That's called critical level utilitarianism, and is also used by some philosophers to avoid this repugnant conclusion in population ethics. So that's it for now. That's the maximum preference principle. It's a consequentialist or utilitarian principle. In the next video I will discuss another principle that refers to the self-determination right. It's a deontological principle that does not look at preferences or well-being or things like that, but looks at rights. So it's based on what is the most important right. And I will discuss why this self-determination right, the right to bodily autonomy, is the most fundamental right. That's for the next chapter.